It's very helpful to hear about those initiatives, and perhaps the two grant recipients can plan to come back to our next conference and share your data with us. That'll be a terrific culmination of your efforts and our efforts. So I'm going to invite the panelists for the next session to come and sit down, and while they're coming up here, I'd like to welcome Dr. Tanisha Carino. She will be our moderator for this panel discussion on addressing value and cost of cancer care. She's a recognized thought leader in health technology assessment and comparative effectiveness research, and in understanding the role that quality and performance measurements play in U.S. healthcare. She also serves as an associate faculty member in the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I don't think she got that position on the internet. At least not to my knowledge. So Tanisha's been engaged in the Turning the Tide Against Cancer initiative for the past couple of years, and most recently she facilitated the expert working group that convened over the past few months to develop the policy options that have been outlined in the issue brief. And if anybody hasn't yet seen it, there are copies at the registration desk. We urge you please to take it and read it and comment on it. So Tanisha, thank you for joining us today. We look forward to this discussion, and welcome to our panelists.
Great. Thank you, Marcia. I want to thank Ed and John and Marcia and their teams for the amazing work that we did this summer. You know, we brought together over 20 folks to help us really cull through what are the various policy options that exist out there that really get at what it means to promote patient-centered research and care in cancer care, but also what there is that's out there in terms of policy options that help us understand how to drive towards value and what it means to manage cost in oncology. So, you know, I commit this. I was a PhD student about 15 years ago, and I was studying under a very well-known research ethicist named Nancy Cass. I don't know if anybody here knows who Nancy is. She's a tremendous woman. She's an amazing ethicist. She also happened to be married to a person that was at CMS at the time, who for the first time was really flexing that agency's muscles as it related to what the role of Medicare was, as it related to managing cost of new technologies. And so as I was finishing my PhD, where I was studying actually adolescent health services research and the role of adolescent health-seeking behavior, I started working in the agency where it was amazing to me that our policies were not based on evidence. It was shocking. You know, here I was, daughter of academics who created research all their lives, married to an academic family. And the disconnect between what we understand to be evidence-based medicine and the type of policies that we were promulgating at that time was vast. So over the last 10 years, I got very, very interested in the world of evidence-based medicine and the world of quality and what data structures were needed and reimbursement systems, coding infrastructures were needed to make better policies. And it was really timely because I think right now, as you hear it, we have the most amazing advances in science that I think any of us could have ever expected. And every morning when I wake up and listen to NPR, there's another story of how science is creating hope for me, for my colleagues, for my family members with cancer. And every day we also hear stories about how do we do it? How do we manage the cost? How do we as a country make the trade-offs that are much, much more difficult? And so, you know, part of what I want to do before getting into the session is like open the framing, because I think it's really important that we consider what we're talking about in terms of oncology and the broader healthcare market and the healthcare system that we operate in. So for 10 years now, all over healthcare, we have been trying to promote three really important concepts: consumer choice and the role of consumers in making choices, through either public reporting of quality and cost information, or even through the engagement of patients and what research matters to them and how best to disseminate information. The government is increasingly focused on working with providers, health plans, even the employer community, as to how do we pay for care. I think that we all long recognize that the way that we have financed and paid for healthcare in this country hasn't necessarily driven us towards a better value system. And so now every day you hear about a new ACO, a new primary care home being started, all these new bundled payment initiatives that change the way we pay for care, but not only changing the way we pay for care, change the way that we work together to deliver that care. And then finally, both government and the private sector have spent millions and millions of dollars of research, really trying to create research that gets at the type of questions that each of these folks on the panel have every day, whether it's creating new data infrastructures that we heard this morning, or whether it's funding the kind of research that really gets at answering questions that patients and their family members have. So all this is to say that healthcare is really changing overall. But in oncology, the thing that is just astounding to me is when I work with cancer and folks that create innovations in oncology, the complexity of the information and the science and how rapidly it's changing is by far the most complex in the system. So I am here today with the goal of having us take that 20,000-foot level discussion that we've been having today and have a chance to facilitate a panel of amazing experts that work on a day-to-day level as it relates to whether it's promoting new innovation in the system, both in new technologies, making treatment choices, understanding what patients need, and also understanding how best to pay for them. So let me introduce our panel. So Dr. Stephen X is the Vice President and Global Head of Oncology and Medical Sciences at Astellas Pharma Global Development. He is directly responsible for the oversight of oncology drug development plans. He's a board-certified hematologist oncologist with broad drug development expertise, came from organizations prior to Astellas, from Lilly and Pfizer, and is also a board member of the Personalized Medicine Coalition. Patricia Goldsmith is the CEO of Cancer Care, where she oversees the vision and the direction of that organization. Cancer Care is the leading national organization providing free and professional support services and information to help people manage the emotional, practical, and financial challenges of cancer. Their programs have reached over 170,000 people each year and provide $22.3 million in financial assistance. Dr. Mike Kalogi is the National Medical Director for Oncology Solutions in the Office of the Chief Medical Officer at Aetna. Since joining Aetna in January of 2013, Mike has been active in Aetna's oncology delivery reform pilots, pharmacy policy, condition analysis, and genetics subcommittee. Prior to joining Aetna, Mike was the Medical Director for Oncology Services for U.S. Oncology from 2007 to 2011, and in this role, he helped direct the implementation of U.S. Oncology's Clinical Pathways Program and the development of their disease management and advanced care planning processes. Dr. Rich Shulsky is currently the Chief Medical Officer of ASCO and previously served as President of ASCO from 2008 to 2009. An international expert in gastrointestinal malignancies and cancer pharmacology, Dr. Shulsky has published over 320 scientific articles, reviews, and commentaries. He has served on numerous committees, including being the member and chair of the NCI Board of Scientific Advisors, member of the Clinical and Translational Research Advisory Committee, and member and chair of the Oncologic Drug Advisory Committee at the FDA. I'm honored and to have a chance to engage with this panelist. And so just like the sessions that we had previously, I have a pre-negotiated set of questions for our panelists. We'll try to invite you all, at least for the last 20 minutes, for a rich discussion as well. Great. So Stephen, the first question goes to you. As somebody who has spent years in R&D and now is facing a very challenging reimbursement role, both here in the United States, but globally, I'd love for you to start off by reflecting how these issues of value play into the choices that you make every day and how you approach your assets, how you design trials, and how you think about moving innovation forward.
In an idealized world, we would know the value of a product the day we began working on it. You start with a basic science concept that you believe is linked to a medical condition, that you can fundamentally change. Unfortunately, it's not actually possible to know the value, even though you know a lot about the disease, you know its prevalence, you know its burden on society. But the one thing you don't know early on is if you were successful with a new medicine, what's the effect size? How well is this going to work? Is this something small? Is this something big? And what's the trade-offs that come with your new drug? Because the drugs don't come without some trade-offs typically. So you intend to invest based on what you think is the probability of technical success, not the probability of value success. Because that's something that you can actually grapple with on scientific terms. You can quantify your rate of success based on the quality of the data you get in the short term. And certainly by the time you get to the clinic, by the time you begin clinical testing, you know a lot of the technical aspects of your new drug. Is it absorbed? How long is it going to last? Is it likely to interfere with other important metabolic processes? But that, at the time you're beginning your clinical testing, you typically don't know the true value. And this is well illustrated by looking at how drugs are valued at the time they're launched many years later. The typical valuation at the time of launch is not linked in retrospect to what it actually turned out to be worth in terms of sales or market share, however you want to measure that. And that's because it's very difficult to predict that in advance. And that's one of the biggest problems the industry faces. We have to invest a lot of capital, put that at risk for a significant period of time, but we only begin to evolve the value story once we're in clinical testing. And of course, as this audience well knows, many of these drugs in clinical testing prove to have no value because they have problems or don't perform as advertised. It's that process of clinical studies that reveals the value. And more often than not, the value story evolves much after the drug is on the market. And we've seen this with many products that weren't expected to be particularly valuable and turned out to be blockbusters. So it's a complex mix of betting on what you think is technical success, making decisions on data, and trying to approximate that you're working towards something that eventually will have value.
Stephen, do you find yourself now shifting a lot more budget to the post-market setting to the point that you're making that you know so much what's happening pre-market? And what does that mean to you in terms of the type of research that you're doing or the engagement that you may have with the payer community and the patient community even further upstream than you typically have had?
Well, obviously, we'd love to launch drugs that have no post-approval commitments. So that would be the ideal setting. If anybody's listening, please take note. But it's hard to anticipate everything that you wanted to know at the time you knew that you wanted to know it. So, and there are a lot of nuances. We operate in a global economy, and so questions that may be important in one economic sector may not have shown up elsewhere. So you will end up doing specialized studies on geographic reasons. For instance, if you want a drug approved in China, you're designing studies that are specific for China. The same is true of Japan. Less so of other countries that may either participate directly in globalized studies or may just accept data from other regions for local approval. So there's the regional differences, but there's also the things that you couldn't have known to ask and therefore didn't design the experiment to answer. So when you get to your large phase 3 studies, invariably things will show up. They could be signals, they could be subtle, they might be obvious, but they're not fully answered at the time you start marketing your product. And so, these signals may show up well after the drug is on the market. So it is a continuous process of reassessment of what's the ongoing question that needs to be answered to properly place this drug in the hands of the right patient.
I'd love to invite my other panelists. Like when you think about I believe John said 800 assets under development across the industry, how much time do you all spend really thinking about or wanting to engage folks like Stephen on, what's the unmet need and how to translate these ideas of what value means to you all as it relates to the type of evidence that's being created?
I guess I can weigh in and say, from just the 4.5 months that I've spent at Cancer Care that I think the patient's needs really have to be factored in very heavily to the design of the trial. And I don't mean their needs from a clinical perspective. Yes, that's important. But I'm talking about very real issues that patients face every day with respect to being able to get transportation to their trial for their treatment, affordability of that, things such as child care and what happens to their children when they have to go for their treatment. The incredible sense of urgency that patients feel to be able to continue to work and be productive, the fear of the consequences of that not happening. So there's a whole host of psychosocial issues that patients have that are very, in my view, disconnected, I think. And I can take, shall we say, some fault, because until I joined Cancer Care, I was very much focused in the academic medicine setting. And the way that you think about trials and the way that you think about the research is sometimes not terribly patient-focused. But no patients, no trials.
So for some reason, people seem to think talking to me would be useful. I'm not exactly sure why. But before I say another word, I have to say this. The opinions I'm about to express are mine and mine alone, and not those of Aetna. Now, the reason I have to say that is because I was on a panel about a year ago, and I made a kind of a joke, I thought it was a joke, about things that'd be much easier if there were a single payer, and then somebody started tweeting that a national medical director from Aetna said there should be a single payer.
Don't quote him on that out of context
there you
at this
go.
forum.
So, I have a really unique perspective, as you said. I was in private practice for a long time, and I was part of the U.S. Oncology Physician Leadership, and most precisely, I was chairman of the P&T committee, and I was involved in formulating the clinical pathways. So as you might guess, pharma really wanted to talk to me a lot, always. And now as medical director at Aetna, even though I have no role in developing coverage policy or contracting, they think they should talk to me. I'm going to be unkind. They don't listen to what I say. They didn't then, and they don't now. I am totally sensitive to what you say, Steve. But of course, in that pre-approval, pre-marketing era, we don't know what the cost is going to be, and therefore we can't actually start to discuss value, right? So as you're trying to make the case for value, the argument should be, how do we make ourselves, how do we distinguish ourselves? How do we make ourselves look better? If we're not willing to compete on price, and by and large, they're not, how do we make ourselves better? How do we make ourselves distinctive? Now again, I don't want to offend anybody, but we do not need another TKI and CML. We don't. It's not that we're curing people with what we got, but it's pretty darn good. We need approaches in other diseases, and there may be 800 drugs in the pipeline, but we have dissociated true innovation from reimbursement. We don't reward true innovation. That's a problem. And if we're not going to cure people, and again, I don't mean to offend anybody, but these targeted therapies don't cure people. They help people, but they don't cure people. Not yet. We need to make the case, and Trish said it great, for why is it better? What does it add? And as is the theme of this morning's commentary and our luncheon speakers, we are not recording what's important to patients. We have no idea what's important to patients. And the extra effort of recording that and communicating that, I understand it doesn't have anything to do with FDA approval. I don't really care. I think as we go forward in this world of healthcare reform, where in fact the insurance companies who have been cast as the bad guys, we heard that just a moment ago, we're not going to be the decision makers. Actually, physicians and integrated delivery systems are going to start being decision makers, and you got to convince them. And they don't know as much as me. Just take my word for that. So I think the problem is they hear what I say and they don't care. Or at least they don't know how to operationalize it. And unless we get past that, unless we actually develop a methodology for collecting what's important to patients, unless we're willing to actually tell the truth about how innovative things really are, then we're stuck in this cycle. And then we have this argument about whether the co-pays are fair, which is nonsense, right? The co-pays are, a patient out of pocket is capped by the ACA. I mean, that's just the way it is. So we have that argument about patient access because the insurance companies won't pay for the drug. Listen, everybody here cares about oncology. That's 10% of Aetna spend. So I assure you, if we had a room full of gynecologists, they would wonder what the heck we're arguing about because they're interested in preterm birth, neonatal costs, unnecessary C-sections, and increasingly prenatal genetic testing, which is not the topic of this conversation. So all I'm saying is we need to take a step back, determine how I convince my partners at Aetna that there really is something cool going on here and that we should rush to pay for it.
I have to challenge you on one thing. Come to our office and sit just for 2 hours and listen to the calls that we get. The patient's expenses are capped at about, $5,900.
I'm with you.
Oh, please. There are people that are asking us for $100 for gasoline. There are people that need food. I mean, it is not realistic. It simply isn't, Mike.
It's a step in the right direction. And I'm with you, Trish. And all I'll say to you is then the sticker price needs to come down.
I want Richard to be, go ahead. I would love, Richard, for you to weigh in on this. Like, as somebody who's practiced being a leader for the professional society of many of these oncologists, Mike is casting a picture of it's not going to be Aetna, it's not going to be United, it's going to be these docs making these decisions. How do you view that evolution of the role of these clinicians, and are they ready, and how do we make people ready to make choices based on solid information, but also with the notion that any evidence that you generate has to have expectation for when it's going to be available?
Well, I want to bring in a couple of concepts here. First of all, I think it's important that we acknowledge that all of us in the medical community have an important role to play in restraining costs and creating value for our patients, all of us. And frankly, I'm getting a little bit tired of the finger pointing between pharma and the insurance companies. And pharma says, oh, it's those darn co-pays, and the insurance companies say, it's those darn drug prices. And both are at play, both contribute to the cost that patients face, but so do the practices that doctors follow, and so do the education that we provide to our patients and patients' understanding of what are realistic expectations given their health status. And I think that all of these factors come into play. Patients need to be well informed about what can and what cannot be achieved in dealing with their care. Doctors need to practice evidence-based medicine in a responsible way. Doctors' reimbursement needs to be reformed to remove the incentives to just do more things instead of spending more time with patients. And then, we need to think about, how to change, excuse me, our insurance system and our regulatory system to be able to bring more value to healthcare. You asked Stephen about, when they're beginning to think about development of a drug, do they consider the value that it can add? And, I think, again, the issue is that this whole concept of value is highly nuanced, very context dependent, and not static. And we have to remember that, a drug that's introduced and gets its initial regulatory approval for, treatment of a far advanced stage of cancer may ultimately have much greater value when, used in earlier stage disease. Or, a drug that is introduced for a broad population and has a modest effect may have a much greater value when there's a biomarker that comes along and allows us to identify the population in whom the drug is most effective. So the whole value discussion is not static, and we need to sort of reassess the value of a therapy each time the context of its use changes. But that said, we are stuck in sort of a static regulatory and reimbursement system, and as far as I can tell, drug prices for branded products never go down, even when there's data to suggest that maybe the drug is actually less effective in a certain population than it was originally supposed to be. and there's this concept of value-based pricing. Let's think about the fact that the price of the drug should some way be related to the value it delivers. And drugs might have different prices in different contexts depending upon the value that is delivered. There's the concept of value-based insurance. There's no patient with CML who should be denied access to Gleevec. That's a drug that should be out there, no co-pays, no co-insurance. Everybody who needs it should get it because it's such a transformative and vital therapy. But there may be other drugs in other circumstances where there should be a significant copay, where perhaps the evidence base for using that drug is substantially less. So if we're going to consider value to be sort of in evolution and context dependent, we need regulatory and reimbursement frameworks that similarly can evolve, and become more context dependent. So I want to just come back, and I don't want to take up all the panel time, but you asked me about this issue of, educating patients and so on. ASCO's been very sensitive to this issue for a long time now. Back in 2007, we formed a task force on the cost of cancer care, and we formed it at that time largely because we were hearing from our doctors and their patients that the costs were going up, that they didn't know how to discuss the costs of care, and that there was a certain level of anxiety and discomfort when those discussions crept into the doctor-patient relationship. So we thought it was important to begin to provide our doctors with education and tools and guidance as to how to have the conversation with patients about cost, and we produced a number of those kinds of tools. But several years ago, it became obvious that the issue is really not about cost. The issue is about value, and there can be high-cost therapies that deliver tremendous value to patients. So we can't isolate on the cost. We have to focus on the value. As Dr. Schnipper said this morning, we reformulated our cost of care task force. It's now a value in cancer care task force. And it has been working now very hard for well over a year to develop a sort of a framework for discussion between doctors and patients about the value of the treatment options that a patient has in any particular clinical context. We are getting very close to completing that project. We are now looking at how essentially to develop a user-friendly, graphical tool that a doctor can use in the context of a clinical encounter with a patient where there's a limited amount of time to get across the key concepts of, what's the value of treatment option A versus treatment option B, and then to be able to vary that discussion based upon the preferences that the patient expresses, because there will be some elements of the value proposition that are more important to some patients and less important to others. And in order to customize this to really meet the needs of an individual person, we need to be able to allow the tool to take those preferences into consideration.
So Dr. Schlossky, I'm probably joined by many of us folks in the room that are very, very eagerly awaiting your work in that area. It's not fully completed yet, but you're at the point where you can probably reflect on the things that were that you didn't anticipate being hard and the things that you were surprisingly easier.
Yeah.
Could you give us a preview of what you've learned to date, and what were the hard parts of developing this framework?
Yeah. So naively, we thought that this would be pretty simple, that we would say, okay, what are the sort of the three major pillars of value? So, it would be efficacy and toxicity and cost. And then we started to think about, okay, well, what exactly do we mean by efficacy? And of course, the evidentiary base for efficacy tends to be the data available from clinical trials. We all know, of course, that the efficacy data is not always the real-world effectiveness data. but it's oftentimes the only data we have. So we said, okay, we'll use the clinical trial data as the evidence base for efficacy, and then was the issue of, well, what clinical trial endpoint do we use? And again, the sort of the standard approach is to say, well, what's most important is overall survival. We'll use that as our primary efficacy endpoint, and to what extent does a new therapy improve overall survival compared to a prevailing standard? And of course, we immediately ran into the issue of, for many of the newer and most exciting therapies, there's no survival data that's available, either because the clinical trials were reported before the survival data was sufficiently mature, because the survival data simply doesn't materialize because of multiple crossovers and second and tertiary lines of therapy, and so on. And we're seeing this now more and more, even as with the breakthrough therapy designation. I mean, drugs are getting introduced into clinical practice, based upon high response rates in, uncontrolled, non-comparative trials. Now, I'm not suggesting that they shouldn't be introduced into practice. I'm just saying that it makes it difficult to rely exclusively on a survival endpoint as a measure of efficacy. And then we have to begin to think about, well, what else is important that we can rely on? We've had similar discussions surrounding toxicity. We're talking about acute toxicity, chronic toxicity. What's reported in the clinical trial data is all toxicity grading based upon the CTCAE by and large. Is that something that's really relevant to patients? Does a patient really know the difference between grade 2 and grade 3 neuropathy, when you go talk to them about it? And then was the issue of cost. What cost estimate do we use? We had chosen in our original conception of this to use the cost as it's reflected by Medicare reimbursement for a drug, so average sales price plus 6%. It was quickly pointed out to us, of course, that cost is irrelevant to patients because they're not paying that. They're paying some out-of-pocket cost based upon what their insurance plan is. And then the final thing I would say is, as we have discussed this increasingly with patient groups, we have gotten the feedback that, number one, they want us to base this on endpoints that are important to patients. Now, we totally agree, and we'd love to be able to do that. The problem is those endpoints are rarely quantified and rarely reported in clinical trials. So where do we get the evidence base to make those assessments on? That's a subject for future research. And the other thing we heard very clearly from patients is they want the discussion to be customized to their unique circumstances. All of our data is based upon studies of a population typically defined by the eligibility criteria of a clinical trial. But where the patient sitting in front of you in the exam room, how that patient fits within that population, or oftentimes doesn't fit at all in that population because they might not even have qualified to participate in the clinical trial. And therefore, what the relevance of all that information is to that individual is very challenging. So that's a long response to your question, Tanisha, but I think, this whole exercise has reinforced to us that this is very nuanced, very complex. We are trying to develop a framework to facilitate conversation between doctors and patients and to allow it to be customizable and easy to use and informative for patients. We'll get there, and I'm hoping we'll get there in the next few months. But it's turned out to be, of course, more complex than we thought it would right at the start.
I know Linda House and Patricia have both mentioned to me this importance of capturing, redefining really what value means, this idea of a very clinical benefit over very narrow definitions of costs and many times. Given ASCO's leadership in this area and leadership that many of your groups have had in trying to really expand what it means to have a patient-focused definition of value, Patricia, could you give us any additional insights in terms of how you're thinking about these areas and what you observe needs to happen? And particularly, we're standing in the shadows of symbols of our government. Like, what's the role of government policies or agencies like an ARC or even like a PCORI in helping create the type of research and endpoints that are important to patients?
So I think we're operating in a very clearly established and often bureaucratic system as it relates to drug discovery, clinical trials, et cetera. And I think there has to be a real paradigm shift on many different levels. As an example, in a lot of the conversations that we've had today about how clinicians interact with patients, the discussions they should be having, how is that being reflected in the curriculum at medical schools? Mike, was that something that was discussed with you when you went to medical school? And quite frankly, what this system, for better or for worse, has done is take physicians like Mike, who are trained to practice medicine, trained to do the best they can and cure a patient, and put them in a situation where they're having to have these conversations about the value, the cost, et cetera, to a patient that really has absolutely no information. And this, I think, is one really problematic area of the system. It is great that we're having these conversations about value and that there's an emphasis on it. But to the patient, there is absolutely no tools out there. I can go out and have better information on how to buy a new refrigerator than I can about making some decisions about my health care. It is so complicated for physicians today, particularly those that are having to operate within different pathway systems, keeping up with all of the new advances. It's very difficult, and we're putting this expectation, and quite frankly, probably without much of any reimbursement or acknowledgement on the part of the physicians. But I also don't think that patients, we hear a lot about patient engagement, and I think that's key and something that needs to happen. But in my view, most of what's happened with patient engagement relates to cost, how much they're paying out of pocket. And yes, that may be a component of patient engagement. It sure makes you pay attention, but I'm not really sure that's where we want to be in all of this. So my belief is that we have to invest in educating patients to be their own advocates and arm them with information. We can talk about this in the system and transforming the system, but we also have to start at the patient level. So for us at Cancer Care, what we're attempting to do is create a major data repository that right now we have tremendous data on patients because of the breadth of services that we provide in the psychosocial arena, in the financial arena, and education arena, but they reside in very disparate databases. We want to bring all of that information together and begin collecting a lot of data about patient experience and being able to share that data with policymakers and with other individuals so that they understand what some of the issues that patients face. I think there would be a lot of surprises. And just as one other example that has been troubling to me for quite some time, I think if you were to ask patients today, 100 oncology patients that walked into a physician's clinic, are you being treated on a pathway? 98% of them would give you a blank stare. 2 might say, yeah, I think I'm on a clinical trial. This is having a major impact in the delivery of oncology care, and patients know nothing about it. And then my last little soapbox stand is, I personally am very weary of the drugs and biologics being the lightning rod in this discussion. I think it's unfair. I think that there's a whole host of other cost drivers and factors in the delivery of oncology care that are not really being discussed. And so, in my view, I think there is an under-acknowledgement of the contributions that pharma biotech has made in many different ways, and an overemphasis on the price of drugs. It is a legitimate issue, and one that somehow needs to be resolved, but it sure isn't the only issue in the cost equation.
So let me speak to the pathways issue, since I have a lot of experience in this space. I'll give you an anecdote. When I was in practice, I did a lot of traveling for US Oncology. Drove my patients crazy that I wasn't there. They'd see my nurse practitioner, who was great. They wanted to see me. And, but when I came back and I saw them, and I had a pretty good relationship with my patients, and let's say we were making a treatment decision. We were on an electronic medical record, and we had implemented a clinical pathways program. So I would bring them over to where the computer was, and I would explain, this is what I'm doing when I'm traveling. This is what I'm working on. So this is what your disease is, right? You have stage 3 colon cancer. And what we've done is we've gotten a bunch of experts within the organization that we're part of who have looked at all the evidence, looked at the toxicity to the best available degree, and looked at the cost. And what they've done is they've given us some preferred choices, and these are the preferred choices. Now, they're not the only choices, and in fact, they may not be the right choice for you. But we're implementing this tool for a couple of reasons. One, we think that by standardizing care, we'll eliminate medical errors and improve the quality of care you receive. Second of all, we think it means that for you, we're going to give you the best possible therapy. And three, we're going to actually learn something useful from this, because we'll be able to take this information and go downstream and try to figure out what's the best way to treat people like you who are sitting here with me. If the pathways choice wasn't the appropriate choice, I would tell them why I didn't think it was the appropriate choice and how we're keeping score and keeping track. My patients loved that. They thought it was so cool. They wanted to be part of it. They wanted to be part of it. Now, how does that apply to this?
Right.
It is exactly the instrument for implementing biomarkers and biomarker-driven therapy. Why? The world is very soon going to get too complicated for any community oncologist to keep up. It's just going to be true. And you're going to have access to a database that will help guide your decision-making, or at least inform your decision-making. And so we have this stupid linear view that it's one mutation, one therapy, one outcome. That's not the way it works, right? There's many mutations, there's drivers, there's passengers, they interact. It may be one treatment, it may be a combination of treatments, it may not be intuitive. There will need to be a link, just from an efficacy perspective, between that bedside decision-making and some knowledge base. Now, that's aspirational, but that's in fact where the ultimate goal of implementing clinical pathways was designed to go. And we've learned something interesting. So for example, you know, we in our medical home pilots, and that's what I work on most of my time, we've learned that if you're an old person with lung cancer who gets chemotherapy, I don't give a hoot what chemotherapy you get put in the hospital a lot. So if you're a lung cancer doctor, maybe you know that. But if you're a community oncologist, your memory is as good as the last couple patients you treated. The data is incontrovertible. So if you're not having a dialogue with that patient about their risk of hospitalization with aggressive treatment, you're doing them a disservice.
So Mike, I think that intellectually, I think everybody understands that there's this huge amount of information that's being created, and there needs to be some type of a distillation of what it is to make the quality of care for every patient and that interaction important and patient-centered. But, you know, I'm a big believer in this idea of hearts and minds, and intellectually that makes a lot of sense, but I still hear on a daily basis concern about transparency. What's that data? Like, how do we know it's not just about cost and holding down costs, and this feeling that I think all of us have responded to about, you know, something being taken away? You know, if these types of tools are going to be more and more important, both for driving better care, but also finding better value in the system potentially, you know, what needs to be created? Is there accreditation bodies that need to be created and some type of transparency? Like, you're a pretty affable guy. Like, I like sitting down with you and you're walking through your computer and it's amazing, but I don't know whether we can expect that from every single person.
All I'll say is you look at the result. Look at the end product. They're all the same. They're not very different. So how they got there may not matter. I'll tell you what the problem is. The problem is we're not learning from what we're putting in there. The problem is we're not sharing that information, we're not collecting it, we're not analyzing it. And we in the payer side are as guilty as everybody else. You know, the people who build electronic medical records are guilty. We're guilty. Why? One thing Trish said that I agree in part with is the sticker price is probably the wrong thing to look at. It's the global cost of care. So if a treatment results in misery that results in hospitalization, we don't capture that in the sticker price. And we need to. It's really important. So the answer is, okay, I know most of the players in this space. They're affable too. I don't question their motives. I don't know. I'm not sure exactly I know why we should question their motives, but that's neither here nor there. If you want to accredit it, accredit it. It doesn't matter. They all come up with the same thing. The end product is the same. So you could question process, but the end product's the same.
I think one of the problems we struggle with, and there is the notion that there's a lot of information that if collected and tidied up and put in a spreadsheet or some relational database, and that we could all just mine it with some cool tools, the answer's in there. I'm not sure that's true. I'm quite somewhat of a skeptic of this, in part because the sensitivity of the tools that people are using, the error rates in the measurement itself, and the errors in the systems that collect these data relative to the effect that you're trying to manipulate. And it's almost as if when I leave, if I'm driving from my house in outside Chicago, and I'm going to drive to Chicago, I can tell you the second that I'll arrive at my destination. There's too many variables for me to know. I can approximate that. So I'm concerned that some of these data, including biomarker data, are very wifty. And we've seen this in some areas. When I started my career, people loved to measure CEAs. And once you know the guy has colon cancer, I'm not sure what the CEA tells you. I think everyone knows the story about prostate-specific antigen. I mean, that test is probably used a few more times than it needed to be. So we need to be careful that to read more into this data than is really there. And it's not that it's not a good idea, but we have to have some really clear discipline on saying, if it isn't going to give me this much new benefit, I don't care. We want to see big effects. So I think when we can deliver a big effect, something that's transformative, I think innovation does get rewarded. I'm not sure we don't need a new TKI for CML. I kind of go where you're thinking, because my idea of that TKI is probably the same as yours, but there might be something that was really innovated that worked mechanistically different than what we're used to. And so we need to be open to that innovation, but it better deliver something big, because that we can measure that. It's not going to take a monster relational database with 20,000 patients, to figure it out. You should be able to see it across the room. And so I think if you want to talk about value, then big effects are easy to value. Small effects are very hard to make aggregate decisions on, because what's important for me may not be important for the next person, and how does that wash out in these systems? We don't collect the data that way. So that's, I think, a real challenge that we should keep in front of us is when we look at these big data sets is, are they going to show us the big effects? Because frankly, that's what we want. We want something big.
So Stephen, let me just pursue that a little bit with you, because Tanisha asked right at the start about how do we assess the value of drugs even as they're in the development phase, and you heard Lowell Schnipper this morning mention this project that ASCO did on clinically meaningful outcomes for clinical trials, and I can tell you that there will soon be another paper that'll be published by a completely different group, also putting out a thought experiment about how to determine what are clinically meaningful outcomes for clinical trials. So if we accept that clinical trial data is the foundation of the evidence base that we all choose to use to assess the impact and effectiveness and value of new treatments, and if we accept your argument that what we want are big effects, okay? So does that mean that a drug company that's developing a new molecule that they anticipate might be able to produce a 3-month improvement in overall survival, should they throw that drug out and move on to the next one in the pipeline that maybe could produce a 6-month improvement or a 9-month improvement? I mean,
I think that's a serious discussion they should have internally, and it depends on when that thought occurs to you. Now, if you've already invested a lot of money and you just got the results of your multinational randomized phase 3 trial and it's 3 months, you're going to promote that as meaningful.
That's a big effect.
Because that's what you've got. I mean, and then the community is going to tell you it isn't or it is. But what we're seeing now in early development is drugs that are potentially better than what's out there, not going forward. Because to prove that it's better, even though you're really convinced and you love this drug that it is better, the cost of proving it in some narrow segment of lung cancer is a lot. And so do you really want to, come up with the next TKI for CML? If I'm sitting here at the end of my phase 1 study and I've got the next CML treatment and I know a lot about it, but I don't know the effect size yet, is your company going to invest in that? Maybe not now. I think we're starting to look more seriously at that and saying we don't need another one of those, and we'll put that money after something else. And I certainly, in our company, we look very seriously at that. I won't say that we shelve drugs that could be useful, but we need to know that it's a big effect. And part of the reason that we want big effects is they're easy to see. And if they're easy to see, I'm done sooner and I've spent less money.
Yeah.
So rather than spend all that money downstream on a large randomized clinical trial to deliver your 1.5 or 2 months, if I can get, if that notion occurs to me at the end of phase 1, maybe I won't take that drug forward and I'll put that money back into discovery and to come up with something else. So I think that point's well taken, and it's not lost in the pharmaceutical industry.
I mean, Stephen, I think that, I think everybody appreciates the type of risk that the industry takes on. And I also appreciate where Mike sits, where the health plan or Medicare doesn't necessarily want to be the person financing the risk. But at the same time, what are policies? Folks are tossing out ideas called social impact bonds, that R&D credits. Like, what is the role of any stakeholder then? Because ultimately, the people that benefit are the patients. So are there policy solutions that when you see, you get really excited about, whether they're coming out of the EU or here in the United States?
I'm not sure there's a policy answer, but I think there's some really clever ideas. I mean, I think the partnership between the CF Foundation and Vertex to bring forward a clever drug is really pretty neat. Because I don't think you could do that without having the patient support that came from the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, helping Vertex go into an area that was pretty financially risky for them. I think the same is true with the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, which is a very patient-centric group. They're certainly facilitating testing drugs in a disease which is not a disease, it's a bunch of diseases. I mean, if you have a chromosome 14 translocation, it's different than if you have some other version of multiple myeloma. And they've done an excellent job of genotyping and categorizing patients by biology and to make it easier to develop drugs. So I think you do need to see sort of more grassroots involvement in a meaningful way. The randomized clinical trial is a great tool. It takes care of some statistical noise and it does answer some questions, but it doesn't answer a lot of the questions that a patient wants. And so there will need to be other types of studies. Maybe these are observational studies that are a little more, where enrollment is more like the patient population that will be seen in the physician's office. There may not be a control arm, and there may be different types of data you can collect at lower cost because you're not doing as much testing. Those types of studies can supplement randomized clinical controls. So I think we have to be very creative, but because I don't think there is a policy or a formula that's going to work for more than one situation. I think we have to take on each new drug problem as it stands and say, what's the next clever way to solve this problem?
So a quick question for you. And so when, the idea of working with patient groups to de-risk drug development, to make it more efficient, to stimulate patient engagement in the process, I think is fabulous, and it's proven successful. And just to be provocative, I guess my question to you is, when you have that kind of circumstance where you have more efficient drug development at presumably less cost to the company, how does that impact your pricing decision when that drug comes out?
Very good question.
Really love Rich's co-moderation of the panel.
I don't think it has as yet, because I think the way drug pricing is not related, is not directly related to those factors. We can have a long discussion about how drugs should be priced, and it's obviously a very sensitive topic in the industry because we don't want to be seen as the bad guys for pricing our drugs too high, but it is a for-profit industry.
Did you see that 60-minute segment the other night?
I did. I did. And I think there's a point. There is a point of diminishing returns on drug pricing, and when the public becomes sensitive about it, then something will happen. But right now, we don't have that interplay between, if I do this for you up front, then can we get a discount on the backside? That may be a discussion that needs to be had. At this point, I would guess that the value to the CF Foundation and to the patients who support the CF Foundation is that somebody actually made a drug for them.
Right.
And that's a pretty good return on their investment. Should that return be something different than that? That's a good discussion.
I just hope all those patients who need it can actually afford to get it.
Well, I actually am going to take moderation's prerogative. I have one question for Mike.
Yeah.
So over the 3 years I spent at Medicare, it became increasingly obvious to me that even with the power of that agency, that we could not revise and modify and keep pace with clinical innovation in our coverage policies. Yep. And in fact, it just became really just self-defeating. And so we began to see ourselves as an agency as providing signals to the market for what was good evidence, or trying to spur the creation of new data infrastructures through our coverage of evidence development policies. Is your feeling now that, the plans, the notion that risk is being transferred to providers, is the role of the plan changing? Do you see them much more engaged in creation of information for better decision making than getting out of the formulary coverage business?
So the answer is not yet. And the reason it's not yet is we are stuck at that same rut that you just described, which is FDA approves the drug, CMS covers the drug, NCCN decides where it belongs, which is invariably on, and then we cover it. That's just the way it is. I mean, that is the paradigm. And it has been the paradigm for a long time. So a lot of my work is engaging providers to start thinking about how to weigh evidence and incorporating that into practice, and then measuring the effect of that. I think the point at which providers are going to be ready to take risk is far off. There is a lot of reasons for that. A huge reason for that is ignorance. Ignorance on the provider's part. So what it actually takes to take care of a patient. What are the costs and what are the risks associated with that? The second thing is I don't think patients are ready for it. I think you had mentioned the trust issue. I think there's huge issues with trust in terms of not delivering care, not offering choice, and not being sensitive to patient needs. And I think that trust chasm needs to be bridged before we're ready to go there. So we have a ways to go. We're trying to take that intermediate step of trying to measure performance. And let's be clear, I don't want to just measure performance because I care. I want to measure performance and make it transparent so that the patients who are Aetna members can see that transparency. Not everybody is so cool with that transparency thing. There's a lot of academic centers who are not cool at all with that transparency thing. They have to get over that. It's time for us to move to that point.
So I'm going to ask one more last question. 4 years ago, when we worked together with the co-conveners to assemble a dialogue around the future of cancer care, one of the aha moments was that the oncology community had been relatively asleep as it related to investing in the creation of performance measures and keeping pace with what other specialties were doing. Where are we today? Are we better off than we were 4 years ago? Are we better off in measuring what the quality of cancer care is, particularly from a patient perspective?
Well, maybe I could jump in on that real quickly. I mean, I would argue that the oncology community has been ahead of many other areas in medicine. At least, you know, ASCO's had a quality assessment and quality improvement program, COPI, in existence for a decade now. So maybe it wasn't in evidence 4 years ago when you were looking for something like that. But that program is a long-standing program now, subscribed to by more than 900 practices in the country. Tens of thousands of case records are evaluated, you know, every 6 months by practices around the country. And now, the problem with COPI, and there are several, but one of the problems with COPI, you asked about performance measures, is that that's exactly what COPI assesses, is performance. And it doesn't assess outcomes. And what we actually need to do is to move away from performance measures and more toward outcome measures, so that we know not only what doctors are doing and not doing, but what impact that has on patients and on the outcomes that patients experience. And that's what we will be doing as we build our next generation, if you will, a quality program called CancerLink, that you know, will have the capability of assessing the outcomes of patients as well as the performance of physicians.
So I just have a question. If you asked 1,000 patients today to talk to you about COPI, how many of them could?
Probably not.
Okay, to the audience, I'm sure you guys are brimming with questions, observations.
Hi, I'm Daryl Pritchard with the Personalized Medicine Coalition. A terrific panel. Thank you, Tanisha, for moderating, and to all the panelists. We've had this conversation about value now for quite some time, and it occurs to me that depending on what stakeholder you are addressing, the key driver of value may differ. So Dr. Shilsky mentioned the key drivers in toxicity, efficacy, and cost. And I'm sure we can all agree that those are the drivers, but the key and most important primary driver probably differs between each stakeholder. So for a patient, for example, the key driver might be simply efficacy and safety. For a payer, it might be cost effectiveness. For industry, it might be improved outcomes in general, and for a practitioner, it might be reduced hospitalizations. The question is, for all four of you, should we and can we have this discussion about value where we're all talking about the same thing? Or should we further characterize this discussion to say the value to a payer, the value to a practitioner, the value to a patient?
I think they're all interrelated. I don't think you can quantify that value in a vacuum because they're all dependent upon one another. But as I've struggled with this and thought about it, there are so many definitions of value, it's talked about earlier, depending upon your stage of life, what your goals of care are, et cetera. But a great starting place would be to find out how we empower and engage patients to have that discussion. I'll just take 2 minutes and tell you a story. Those of you that know me know that I have been at Cancer Care now about 4.5 months. 10 days before I started this job, I was diagnosed with cancer. I had no clue this was coming. I can tell you that my definition of value would be very different. My biggest concern was, I'm starting a new job. What am I going to tell the chair of the board? How can I work? And then, as I have spectacular access to the oncology community, I had spectacular insurance. It was a challenge and a complicated challenge to navigate through putting everything together that I needed for my surgery and my treatment. And I have to tell you, as informed as I am, it was difficult. I had a wonderful surgeon. I actually had 2 surgeons that performed the procedure. But to have and engage in a conversation with very talented, skilled surgeons that trained at Memorial Sloan Kettering about what my wishes and my desires were and what I needed out of that experience, and then the same, even more complicated discussion when it came to radiation therapy. I am not the average person, and so for me, that was a challenge. As armed as I am with information, we have to do better by patients.
Anybody else want to respond?
Well, I would just say, I mean, of course, I agree with that. So much of this comes down to the one word that Suleika left us with at the luncheon, which is communication, okay? And doctors, like everybody else, have varying communication skills. But the one thing that doctors don't have is time. And of course, time is an essential element of communication. You cannot communicate adequately with a patient on a complex issue like a cancer diagnosis in 15 minutes. And there, of course, there are also no incentives built into the current physician reimbursement system to allow doctors to extend that amount of time. So one of the things that we need to do is, equip doctors to do it, encourage doctors to do it, and enable doctors to, expand that communication by shifting the way in which doctors get paid so that they get paid for spending that time with the patient instead of just writing prescriptions for drugs and tests.
I mean, Richard, the issue brief also pointed out that, increasingly it's becoming a team-based effort, right? And so it's not even just giving the doctor more time, it's allowing for emails or physician extenders, pharmacists to be able to work as a team and reimburse for the time that it really takes to coordinate care.
Absolutely. I mean, all of those elements are essential because, the communication is not a one-shot deal. It's not, you sit with the doctor for a half hour and that's all you ever need to know. I mean, it is a continuing dialogue between the patient and the healthcare team because, circumstances change, people forget things, new things occur. And it's, of course, it's not always going to be the doctor who's available when the question comes up, but that means, that there need to be other members of the healthcare team. I mean, to me, despite all the discussion about, patient-centered medical home and, all of that sort of stuff, to me, the core of the patient-centered medical home is to enable better communication between the healthcare team and the patient so as to minimize the probability of an adverse outcome for the patient. And whether that means the doctor's office is open longer hours, there's a nurse practitioner on call 24/7, there's better patient navigation and patient education, and all of these elements that are considered to be part of the patient-centered medical home. It all basically boils down to the patient needs to get the education they need when they need it in order to avoid an adverse outcome.
So it's not so much, I think, that each of us has a different view of value. I think the real problem is that the information that is required for each of us to draw a conclusion, and more importantly, for the patient to draw a conclusion about value, those data elements are in silos that don't communicate. And the silos are proprietary for whatever reason, so there's no transparency. You can't trust the information in the silos. It's incomplete. Our biggest challenge is to find a way to collect the information, and that includes all the patient-reported outcomes we talked about this morning, which have not been collected at all.
Right.
Put them in a place where I can look at them, and Trish can look at them, and the patient that I just counseled on my recommendations for appropriate therapy of whatever disease, they can go and they can twist it and look at it and say, this is what that treatment would look like for me. And it needs to include cost because financial toxicity is real. And it needs to include what patients like me have experienced. And it needs to be free of hype. It needs to be fair. And what I heard at lunch actually was we need truth-telling. We need truth-telling.
And I think you bring up a good point as it relates to, I always laugh when people say data liberation. Well, data liberation, when I hear it, is like the hipster healthcare movement. My favorite term, right? But it's actually very, very fundamental to a lot of what we're talking about in terms of becoming a learning healthcare system. And it's not just having that data, but it's allowing access,
Yes.
to the patient, to Stephen, whose organization could be looking at that data and deriving insights in terms of where there really is unmet need. I think we have another question.
I have a question and a comment. This has been impactful. This has been impactful.
And as a patient, I think one of the things that is occurring to me, and it was brought up here, is the trust issue. And so, Dr. Mike, if you had that same conversation with the patient and you put on your Aetna hat and you said, I'm going to show you all of this, just think about how that might have been taken, because the transparency issue, it goes back to who's it coming from. But I can tell you, I'm a 19-year cancer survivor. Everybody's cousin, brother, it's a peer-to-peer support. 24/7. I had the fortunate and unfortunate experience of leading Wyoming National Breast Cancer Organization, which went out of business. But it was 150 breast cancer survivors, volunteers, available 24/7 to talk to other patients. And they talked to people like you all, who they could call in the middle of the night, be anonymous, and say things that they would be embarrassed to say out in the street, that they didn't hear a word the doctor said, as we said, when they said they had cancer. So I am an activist, I am an advocate. Give me some talking points so we can rise up as patients to drive this, because people will trust us. We will trust each other, and policymakers will listen. I know it's not simple, but let's start thinking in terms of things people understand, not, you know, and
Great.
So actually, it doesn't matter whether I wear an Aetna hat. I would say the same thing. It doesn't make any difference. The people who know me know that's true, and that's why I'll never rise above my current position. But
Great. I think we have time for one more question from the audience. Or Great. Well, I would like to thank this fantastic panel and my awesome co-moderator. It was wonderful. It was great.
I am looking forward to seeing you.